Look at your feet right now. Those feet carry the legacy of countless ancestors who walked before you. But here is something strange. About 100,000 years ago, humans just like you tried to leave Africa. They walked north with hope and determination, and then they vanished completely from history. We think of human migration as this inevitable success story. Our ancestors left Africa, spread across the world, and here we are. But that is not what happened the first time. The first time we failed, and almost no one talks about it. If you are using this to fall asleep, perfect. This mystery has waited 100,000 years. It can wait a few more hours while you drift off. Tonight we are going to explore one of the strangest chapters in human history. Subscribe and stick around. In the 1930s, archaeologists made a discovery in what is now Israel inside caves called Skul and Kafse. They found human remains, not Neanderthal remains, not some ancient cousin species, fully modern humans, Homo sapiens. People who looked exactly like you and me. The initial finds came from Mount Carmel, a limestone ridge running along the Mediterranean coast. The caves had formed millions of years ago as water-dissolved rock. They provided shelter protection from weather and predators, perfect places to live, and eventually to die. The Skul cave sits high on the ridge below. The land falls away toward the sea. 100,000 years ago, sea levels were lower. The coastline was further west, but the view would still have been spectacular. The first migrants chose good real estate. The dating came back, and everyone was confused. These remains were between 90,000 and 120,000 years old. That is 40,000 years before the migration that supposedly populated the world. These people left Africa early, way early, and then they disappeared. Early researchers struggled to explain what they had found. The dominant theory held that modern humans originated in multiple places. These Levantine finds were awkward. They seemed too old, too far from where humans should have been at that time. Think about that for a moment. Humans successfully walked out of Africa, established communities in the Middle East, lived there for potentially thousands of years. And then nothing. Their genetic signature vanishes. Their archaeological trail goes cold. It is like they never existed at all. The route they took matters. From East Africa, through the Horn, across what is now the Red Sea at its narrowest point, up through the Arabian Peninsula and into the Levant, or perhaps north through the Nile Corridor and across the Sinai. Multiple paths were possible. This is what scientists call the first out-of-Africa migration, or sometimes the failed migration, and for decades it has posed one of the most puzzling questions in human evolution. What went wrong? How do you fail at something your species would later accomplish so completely? The Skul cave alone contained remains of at least 10 individuals, not random isolated finds. A population. People who lived and died in this place over generations. They were not passing through. They had settled here, built lives, raised children. Facial reconstructions of the Skul people show faces that would not look out of place today. High foreheads, prominent chins. The gracile features we associate with modern humans. Looking at them, You could forget you are looking at someone who lived 100,000 years ago, and here is something remarkable. Some of the school burials included grave goods, intentional offerings placed with the dead. This suggests symbolic thinking, belief in some kind of afterlife, or at minimum, respect for the dead that went beyond simple disposal of bodies. One burial included a wild boar jaw positioned near the skeleton's hands. Why? We do not know. But someone made a deliberate choice, took time and effort to prepare this burial in a specific way. These were not primitive people stumbling through life. They had culture. The QFC site yielded even more evidence of symbolic behavior. Shell beads, ochre pigments, objects that served no practical survival purpose. These people decorated themselves. They marked their identities with objects. They had art 100,000 years ago. To understand what happened, we need to understand what these early migrants actually had. They made tools, sophisticated stone, implements that required planning and skill. They were not primitive in the way we sometimes imagine ancient humans. They were smart, capable, determined enough to walk hundreds of miles into unknown territory. Their toolkit included hand axes, scrapers, and points. Items suitable for butchering animals, processing plants, and working hides. Everything a mobile hunting and gathering group would need to survive in varied terrain. They came prepared for the challenges they expected to face. The animal bones found alongside human remains tell us what they ate. Deer, gazelle, wild cattle, occasionally larger prey like rhinoceros. They were successful hunters, good enough to sustain populations for generations. Whatever killed them, it was not incompetence. The school and QFC people were not lost. They knew how to survive in challenging environments. Africa had prepared them for hardship, droughts, predators, competition for resources. They had faced all of it. So why did the Levant defeat them when Africa had not? The answer might lie in scale. Africa is enormous with countless microenvironments. The Levant is comparatively small. When African environments deteriorated, populations could move. In the Levant, the options for retreat were limited. There was less room for error. The seasons in the Levant were more extreme than African tropics. Cold winters, hot summers, populations adapted to equatorial conditions faced new challenges. Caves became crucial, not just for shelter, but for survival through harsh seasons. The school and QFC caves were prime real estate, protected, defensible, cool in summer, warm in winter. From these caves, the first migrants could watch their territory, see approaching threats, track animal movements. The caves were command centers for survival in unfamiliar terrain. Here is the first theory, and it is a big one. When modern humans arrived in the Levant 100,000 years ago, someone was already there. Neanderthals, our closest evolutionary cousins. They had lived in Europe and the Middle East for hundreds of thousands of years, and they were not about to share. Neanderthals are often portrayed as brutish cave dwellers, but that image is deeply unfair. They survived ice ages that would have killed most species. They cared for their sick and elderly. They buried their dead with apparent ritual. They were formidable people in every sense. Physically, Neanderthals were built for close quarters hunting. Stocky bodies with barrel chests. powerful limbs designed for explosive strength. Their bones show repeated injuries consistent with getting dangerously close to large prey. They were not afraid of mammoths. Their brains were actually larger than modern human brains on average, but they were organized differently, more visual processing, less frontal lobe development. What this meant for their cognition is still debated, but they were not stupid. They were adapted to a different way of life. Neanderthals were physically stronger than modern humans. They had larger brains. They had survived ice ages that would have killed most species, and they knew the land, every water source, every cave, every hunting ground. The modern humans were walking into occupied territory with no map and no allies. Think about what local knowledge means in a survival context. Neanderthals knew where water could be found during drought. They knew which caves stayed warm in winter. They knew the migration patterns of every animal in the region. Modern humans knew none of this. The competition theory suggests that Neanderthals simply outcompeted our ancestors, not through warfare necessarily, but through resource competition. When food became scarce, the locals who knew where to find it survived. The newcomers who did not know the land starved. It is a harsh but plausible explanation. Imagine arriving in a new land and discovering that every good hunting spot is already claimed. Every reliable water source is already known to others who got there first. You are competing for survival against people who have been perfecting their strategies for hundreds of thousands of years. But here is the thing. The evidence for direct conflict between Neanderthals and early modern humans is surprisingly thin. We do not find massacre sites. We do not find defensive fortifications. If this was a war, it left almost no archaeological trace at all. Some researchers suggest the two populations mostly avoided each other. Different ecological niches, different hunting strategies. They might have been neighbors who rarely interacted directly, competition without conflict, resource division without violence. Some researchers point to something bigger than Neanderthals' climate. The period between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago saw dramatic shifts in global temperature. Ice ages came and went. Deserts expanded and contracted. The world was not stable. It was changing constantly. Scientists study ancient climate through multiple proxies. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, sediment layers from ocean floors, pollen records preserved in lake beds. The picture that emerges is of a world in constant flux during this period. Marine isotope stage 5, as scientists call the period around 100,000 years ago, saw wild temperature swings, brief warm intervals followed by rapid cooling. Sea levels rose and fell by dozens of meters. Entire ecosystems shifted hundreds of miles north or south. The Skool and Kafse people arrived during one of the warm intervals. The Levant was relatively lush. Mediterranean forests extended further south than they do today. Rainfall was adequate. Game was abundant. It must have seemed like paradise after the African savannas. Around 80,000 years ago, global temperatures dropped significantly. Ice sheets expanded across northern Europe. The Middle East became drier and more hostile. The green corridors that humans had used to leave Africa started to close. Migration routes that had been passable became death traps. The change was not instantaneous. It happened over generations. Grandparents might have told stories of plentiful rain that grandchildren never witnessed. Rivers that had flowed reliably for centuries gradually dried to seasonal trickles. Forests shrank. Grasslands turned to scrub. Picture this. You are one of the school humans. Your grandparents walked here through grasslands and forests. They found water, they found game, but now the rivers are drying up, the animals are leaving, and the way back to Africa is through desert that grows wider every year. Climate change operates on timescales that are hard for humans to perceive. Year-to-year variation masks the larger trend. Maybe this year was dry, but next year will be better. Maybe the herds moved, but they will return. Hope keeps you in place until it is too late to leave. The climate theory makes a lot of sense on paper, but it raises its own questions. If climate killed the first migration, why did humans survive in Africa during the same period? Africa was not immune to climate change. Something about the Levant specifically proved fatal. The answer might be habitat diversity. Africa is enormous. When one region became inhospitable, humans could move to another. The continent offered forests, coasts, mountains, and savannas. The Levant was smaller. When conditions deteriorated, there was nowhere else to go. Africa spans over 30 million square kilometers. The entire Levant region is perhaps a few 100,000. The scale difference matters enormously for population survival. In Africa, you could walk for months and still find new territories. In the Levant, you quickly hit boundaries. Think of Africa as a lifeboat with many compartments. If one floods, you move to another. The Levant was a lifeboat with one compartment. When it started filling with water, the only option was to go back where you came from. But what if you could not get back? The Sahara Desert is one of the most hostile environments on Earth today. But 100,000 years ago, it went through periodic green phases. Wet periods when monsoon rains created lakes and grasslands, where sand dunes stand now. These green windows opened and closed over thousands of years. During green phases, the Sahara supported crocodiles and hippos. Fish swam in lakes larger than some modern countries. Elephants and giraffes grazed on grasslands that no longer exist. Rock art in now barren regions depicts swimming scenes. The desert remembers its time as paradise. These wet periods were driven by shifts in Earth's orbit. Subtle changes in axial tilt-altered monsoon patterns. More rain fell further north. Lakes formed in basins that are now sand seas. And humans walked through regions that would kill them today within hours. When the Sahara was green, humans could walk across it, north into the Mediterranean, east toward the Middle East. These green corridors were the highways of early human migration, and like any highway, they could be closed for construction, or in this case, closed by drought. The transitions between green and dry phases could be surprisingly rapid. Some climate models suggest shifts happening within centuries rather than millennia. A few generations might be enough to turn grassland into sand, not slow enough to adapt, not fast enough to respond strategically. The first migration might have been trapped. Humans walked into the Levant when the corridor was open. Then climate changed. The Sahara dried out behind them. The Levant dried out around them. They were caught between two deserts with no escape route. The distance from the Levant back to hospitable Africa is roughly 1,000 kilometers, through terrain that was becoming increasingly hostile, without maps or GPS or any certainty about what lay ahead. The journey that brought them there might have become impossible to reverse. We will never know exactly what those final generations experienced. The archaeological record does not capture their fear, their hunger, their confusion about why the world was becoming impossible to live in. It only shows us that they were there, and then they were not. The bones themselves tell a story of hardship. Some of the school remains show Harris lines, stress markers that form when bone growth is interrupted by malnutrition or disease. These people faced hard times. Their bodies recorded the struggle even when they could not write it down. But here is the thing. Climate and competition are not the only explanations. Some researchers have proposed something more subtle, something about the humans themselves, not their bodies or their environment, their technology. The tools from school and coifs are sophisticated for their time, but they are not as advanced as the tools humans would carry on their successful migration 40,000 years later. The first migrants had good technology. The second wave had better technology. Maybe better was the difference between life and death. The school people used what archaeologists call Levallois technique, a method of preparing stone cores to produce predictable flake shapes. It requires skill and planning. You have to visualize the final tool inside the raw stone before you start knapping. Not simple work, but Levallois technology had limits. The tools were relatively large. They required good quality stone, and they could not be easily modified or repaired in the field. If your spear point broke far from camp, you might not be able to replace it until you returned. Specifically, the later migrants had developed what archaeologists call microlithic technology, smaller, more versatile tools that could be combined into composite weapons, arrows, barbed spears, implements that gave them an edge over both Neanderthals and their own ancestors. Microlithic tools represented a revolution in efficiency. The same amount of stone could produce far more cutting edge. Small bladelets could be glued into wooden handles to create knives, arrows, and complex hunting weapons. Portability and versatility increased dramatically. A hunter with microlithic arrows could strike from distance. A hunter with a Levallois spear had to get close. In competitions with Neanderthals, who were physically stronger at close range, that distance advantage might have been decisive. Range equals survival. But tools are only part of the story. The later migrants also showed evidence of symbolic thinking, art, jewelry, burial rituals. These things might seem frivolous when you are starving, but they represent something crucial: social cohesion, group identity, the ability to cooperate in ways that transcend immediate survival. Symbolic behavior serves practical purposes that are not immediately obvious. Face paint marks you as part of a group. Shell beads signal your social status. Burial rituals reinforce bonds between the living. These are technologies for building and maintaining social networks. A 2018 study published in Nature suggested that the successful out-of-Africa migration coincided with a revolution in human social behavior. Not just better tools, better cooperation, larger social networks, the ability to share information and resources across greater distances. Social networks act as insurance against local disasters. If your group faces a drought but maintains connections with groups in wetter areas, you can move temporarily. You can ask for help. You can share information about where conditions are better. Isolation is death. The first migrants might have traveled in smaller groups, extended families perhaps. When conditions deteriorated, they had only each other to rely on. The later migrants may have maintained connections with dozens or hundreds of other people. When one group struggled, others could help. Archaeological evidence for long-distance trade networks appears more strongly after the successful migration. Obsidian from specific volcanic sources found hundreds of kilometers away. Marine shells far inland, ochre from rare deposits transported over mountains. The movement of goods implies the movement of information. Think about that for a moment. The difference between success and failure might not have been strength or intelligence. It might have been the ability to ask for help, to trust strangers, to see yourself as part of something larger than your immediate family. Now, here is where the mystery gets even stranger. If we are all descended from the successful migration around 60,000 years ago, the first migrants left no genetic trace. Their DNA should be absent from all living humans. And for a long time, scientists assumed it was. Extracting DNA from bones 100,000 years old is extraordinarily difficult. The molecules degrade over time. Contamination from modern sources is a constant threat. For decades, the Skule and Kues remains were too old, too fragmented, to yield usable genetic material. But recent genetic studies have complicated the picture. Some researchers have found hints of ancient gene flow, traces that suggest modern humans might have mixed with populations in the Middle East before the main migration. The first migrants might not have vanished completely, they might have been absorbed. Modern genetics can detect population mixing events that happened thousands of generations ago. The signatures are faint but distinctive. Different populations leave different patterns in the genome. With enough samples and sophisticated analysis, ancient relationships can be reconstructed. A 2019 study in the journal Science identified genetic signatures in some Middle Eastern populations that could not be explained by the main out-of-Africa migration. These signatures were older, much older. They might be the genetic ghosts of the first failed migration. The methodology involves looking for genetic variants that do not fit the expected pattern. If everyone outside Africa descends from the same founder population, certain patterns should be universal. Deviations from those patterns suggest additional ancestry sources. If this is true, the first migration was not a complete failure. Some individuals survived long enough to encounter the second wave of migrants. They had children together, and those children carried DNA from both populations into the future. The first migrants live on, hidden in our genomes. Imagine the scenario: a few survivors of the first migration hanging on in marginal territory. Then a new wave of people arrives from Africa. People with better tools, larger numbers. The survivors join the newcomers. Their genes blend into the expanding population. But here is the thing. The genetic evidence is still controversial. The signals are faint and difficult to interpret. We are talking about population events from 100,000 years ago. The statistical noise is enormous. Not all researchers are convinced the first migrants left any genetic legacy at all. Some geneticists argue that the unusual signatures can be explained by later population movements, mixing events that happened more recently than the first migration, statistical artifacts in the analysis methods. The field is actively debating what the data actually shows. The honest answer is that we do not know for certain what happened to the Skul and Kevse people. We have theories. We have evidence that supports multiple scenarios, but we cannot point to one explanation and say definitively this is why they failed. And maybe that uncertainty is important. It reminds us that human success was never guaranteed. Our survival as a species hung on factors we still do not fully understand. We were not destined to inherit the earth. We got lucky multiple times, in ways we are only beginning to appreciate. Let us talk about the successful migration. Around 60 to 70,000 years ago, a new wave of humans left Africa. They followed the coastlines. They island hopped. They moved faster and farther than their ancestors could have imagined possible. The coastal route hypothesis suggests these migrants hugged the shorelines. Coastlines provide reliable resources: shellfish, fish, fresh water from rivers. You can walk along a coast for thousands of kilometers without ever facing the uncertainty of open desert. Archaeological evidence from coastal sites shows rapid human movement during this period. Shell middens appear suddenly in previously unoccupied regions. The expansion was not gradual, it was explosive. Humans spread along coastlines like fire along a fuse. Within a few tens of thousands of years, these migrants had reached Australia. They had populated Europe. They had pushed into the frozen north of Asia, and eventually they crossed into the Americas. Every non-African human alive today descends from this successful migration. Reaching Australia required water crossings. Even during ice ages when sea levels were lower, significant ocean gaps remained. The successful migrants built boats or rafts capable of open water journeys. The first migrants showed no evidence of such technology. The willingness to cross water barriers represents a mental, as well as technological advance. You have to imagine that land exists beyond the horizon. You have to trust your vessel. You have to coordinate a group effort. These are sophisticated cognitive and social achievements. What made the difference? Why did this migration succeed where the first one failed? Scientists have proposed several factors: better climate conditions, superior technology, larger population numbers. But one factor stands out above the others: the successful migrants were not trying to escape Africa. They were expanding it. The first migrants seem to have made a clean break. They walked into new territory and tried to survive there independently. The successful migrants maintained connections. They did not abandon Africa. They extended its human network across the planet. Population genetics supports this interpretation. The successful migrants appear to have maintained large effective population sizes throughout their expansion. They were not small isolated groups. They were connected communities spreading outward while staying in contact. This might explain why the successful migrants could weather climate fluctuations that killed the first wave. When conditions worsened in one area, information and resources could flow from other areas. No single community was completely alone. The network was stronger than any individual part. Information is a resource often overlooked in migration studies. If one group discovers a new food source or develops a better technique, that knowledge can spread through networks. Isolated groups miss out on collective innovations. Connected groups benefit from everyone's discoveries. Archaeological evidence shows that successful migrant populations traded over remarkable distances. Shells from the coast have been found hundreds of miles inland. Ochre from specific deposits appears in sites far from its source. These people were connected in ways the first migrants apparently were not. Trade implies trust. You exchange goods with people you expect to see again, people whose reputation matters. This kind of sustained relationship requires cognitive capacities beyond immediate survival. Planning, memory, social intelligence, the architecture of cooperation. The successful migrants also handled Neanderthal contact differently. Instead of competing to extinction, there was mixing. Modern human DNA contains fragments of Neanderthal genetic material. Between 1 and 4% of the genome for most non-African populations. We did not just defeat the Neanderthals, we merged with them. This interbreeding was discovered through advances in ancient DNA analysis. In 2010, scientists successfully sequenced the Neanderthal genome. The result shocked many researchers. We had been having children with Neanderthals for tens of thousands of years. This interbreeding was not a minor footnote. Some of the Neanderthal genes we carry provided crucial advantages. Immune system adaptations for European diseases, genes for processing certain foods, traits that helped our ancestors survive in environments they had never evolved to inhabit. Neanderthal genes helped modern humans deal with cold. Certain variants affecting skin and hair that many Europeans carry today came from Neanderthal ancestors. These were not random passengers in our genome. They were selected for because they helped survival. Perhaps more importantly, Neanderthals had developed immune adaptations to European pathogens. When modern humans arrived, they were exposed to unfamiliar diseases. Inheriting Neanderthal immune genes may have provided crucial protection during those first dangerous generations. The first migrants might have seen Neanderthals only as competitors. The successful migrants saw them as potential partners, potential sources of knowledge about local environments, potential allies in a hostile world. This shift in perspective could have been decisive. We do not know how Neanderthals and modern humans interacted socially. Were there marriages in any recognizable sense, trading relationships, language exchange? The genetic evidence tells us they had children together. The cultural evidence is much harder to interpret. There is another theory that researchers find compelling. The successful migrants were simply luckier, not better, not smarter, just fortunate enough to leave during a climate window that stayed open longer. Random chance rather than superior abilities. The timing of the successful migration coincided with favorable conditions in both Africa and the expansion routes. The Sahara had passable corridors. Arabian Peninsula received adequate rainfall. The Levant was not the death trap it had been 40,000 years earlier. Climate records show that the period around 60,000 years ago saw relatively favorable conditions in the Middle East. The Sahara had green corridors, the Levant had sufficient rainfall, the path to Asia was open and passable. The successful migrants hit a good stretch of weather that lasted long enough. If this theory is correct, the first migrants were not failures. They were pioneers who arrived too early. They did everything right. They just did it during a climatic window that slammed shut behind them. 30,000 years later, someone else tried the same thing and got lucky. The universe does not care about intentions or abilities. Climate does not reward courage. The first migrants may have been every bit as capable as those who succeeded later. They were simply born at the wrong time in the wrong oscillation of global weather patterns. There is something humbling about that possibility. We like to think our ancestors succeeded because they were exceptional, because they had something special. But maybe they just happened to leave at the right time. The first migrants had the same potential. The universe just gave them a harder deal. Consider how arbitrary timing can be. A few generations earlier or later might have made all the difference. The climate window might have stayed open. The resources might have held out. Success or failure sometimes comes down to accidents of timing. We should talk about what the first migrants left behind. Not much, in archaeological terms. A few dozen skeletal remains. Stone tools scattered across several sites, possible evidence of symbolic behavior. It is a thin record for thousands of years of human presence in the region. The archaeological record is biased toward preservation. Bones survive. Stone survives. But wood, leather, woven baskets, and most of what makes up daily life decays to nothing. We see only a fraction of what the school people actually had. But every one of those artifacts was made by a human being. Someone who had hopes and fears and relationships. Someone who probably had no idea they were part of a failed experiment in human expansion. They were just living their lives, trying to survive. Doing what humans do. Each tool represents decisions. What stone to select. What shape to aim for. How much time to invest in finishing. These are not random objects. They are frozen moments of human intention. Thoughts made physical 100,000 years ago. The School and Qafse people probably did not think of themselves as migrants or pioneers. Those are categories we impose looking backward. They were just people who walked a little farther than their parents, who found new places to live, who had children and told stories and eventually died. Children were born in the Levant, who had never seen Africa. For them, the caves were home. The local landscape was all they knew. They were not pioneers. They were just people living in their hometown. A hometown that would eventually fail them. Somewhere in the Levant, the last of the first migrants died. We do not know where or when. We do not know if they understood what was happening to their population. We only know that they stopped leaving traces. The archaeological record simply ends. What did the last ones think? Did they know they were the last? Did they hold hope that relatives would appear from somewhere? Or had they been alone so long that the concept of other humans became abstract? We will never know. That silence in the record is haunting. For potentially tens of thousands of years, humans lived in the Middle East. They adapted to local conditions, They developed their own traditions, and then they vanished so completely that we only rediscovered them in the 20th century. The caves were known to local people for centuries before scientists arrived. They were just caves, holes in hillsides. No one suspected they held evidence of populations that had lived and died before recorded history began anywhere on Earth. The discovery of the school and Kafse remains changed how we understand human history. Before those finds, the Out of Africa story was simple. Humans left once and succeeded. Now we know the story is more complicated. Humans tried multiple times. Most attempts failed. And here is something even more recent research suggests. School and Kafse might not even be the first failed attempt. There are tantalizing hints of even earlier excursions, possible human presence in Arabia 130,000 years ago, in Greece over 200,000 years ago. In 2018, researchers reported finger bone fragments from Saudi Arabia dating to approximately 88,000 years ago. Modern human bones in a region far from the School and Kafse sites, another population that ventured out of Africa and then disappeared. The Al-Wusta site in Saudi Arabia challenged assumptions about human migration routes. These people did not follow the Levantine corridor. They were in the heart of what is now desert. During a wetter climate phase, Arabia was passable. When conditions changed, they vanished. A 2019 study published in Nature reported human remains from a Greek cave dating to over 210,000 years ago. If confirmed, humans were leaving Africa and entering Europe nearly 150,000 years before the successful migration. And those populations vanished too. The Epidema skull, as it is called, remains controversial. Not all researchers accept the dating, but it suggests a pattern. Humans kept trying to leave Africa, and they kept failing, over and over, for hundreds of thousands of years. Until finally, something clicked. The Epidema finding, if accurate, means modern humans reached Europe before Neanderthals fully occupied those regions. Then they disappeared. Then Neanderthals moved in. Then modern humans returned 150,000 years later and stayed. The back and forth is dizzying. Why did humans keep trying? Africa was home. It was where we evolved. It had everything we needed. What drove generation after generation to walk into unknown territory where so many before them had perished? Some scientists think the answer is population pressure. When human numbers grew too large, some groups were pushed to the margins. They had to expand or starve. Migration was not adventure, it was survival. The ones who stayed in Africa had won. The ones who left had lost. Africa has carrying capacity limits. When populations exceed those limits, something has to give. Either populations crash through disease or starvation, or some groups move to find new resources. Migration might have been the desperate option for those who could not compete at home. Others think curiosity is enough of an explanation. Humans are uniquely driven to explore, to see what is over the next hill, to find out if the stories about distant lands are true. This trait might be deeply encoded in our psychology. We cannot help but wonder. Every human society has explorers, people who push past known boundaries. In modern terms, We call them adventurers or scientists or pioneers. In ancient times, they were just people who could not resist finding out what lay beyond. The truth is probably some combination, pushed by necessity, pulled by curiosity. Either way, humans kept walking out of Africa, and they will keep doing it. The same impulse that drove the school people north now drives us to think about Mars. But here is the thing that makes the first migration special. Every subsequent attempt was informed by failure, not directly. The school people could not send messages to the future, but evolution and culture have a way of encoding lessons. The populations that eventually succeeded might have carried adaptations born from earlier failures. Consider this possibility. The first migrants who died in the Levant had relatives back in Africa. Those relatives continued evolving, continued developing new technologies, continued building larger social networks. The death of the first migrants created evolutionary pressure that shaped the successful ones. We cannot prove this directly, but it makes a kind of sense. Every failure teaches something. Even failures that leave no survivors can teach lessons to those watching from a distance. The first migration might have failed in person, but succeeded as a warning. What does the first failed migration tell us about ourselves? Several things, all of them humbling. First, we are not as special as we like to think. Humans are smart and adaptable, but we are not invincible. The right combination of circumstances can wipe us out, just like any other species. Second, our success was not inevitable. For most of our existence as a species, humans were confined to Africa. We were a regional animal like any other. The fact that we eventually spread everywhere is remarkable. It required specific conditions that easily might not have occurred. Third, cooperation matters more than individual strength. The first migrants were probably just as intelligent as the successful ones. They might have been stronger or braver, but they were not as connected. They did not have the networks that would let the later migrants survive disasters. And here is the thing that might be most relevant. Today, we are still migrating, still pushing into new environments, still testing the limits of where humans can survive. Space, the deep ocean, extreme climates altered by our own activities. The lessons of the first failed migration apply to all of these frontiers. Technology alone is not enough. You need support networks, you need the ability to adapt when conditions change, you need luck, and you need to accept that failure is always possible. Some researchers have explicitly compared Mars colonization proposals to the first out-of-Africa migration. Small groups of humans trying to survive in a hostile environment with limited resources and no easy way back. The parallels are striking and worth considering seriously. Every Mars colony proposal includes detailed plans for redundancy and self-sufficiency, multiple life support systems, backup food production, independent power sources. Lessons learned from the first failed migration, whether explicitly or not. But we also have advantages the first migrants lacked. We can simulate environments before entering them. We can send supplies ahead of people. We can maintain communication even across vast distances. We have learned from 100,000 years of failure. The first migrants trained through experience, trial and error, each generation teaching the next what worked. Modern colonists can practice in simulators, run through scenarios, prepare for emergencies before they happen. Knowledge transfer has accelerated dramatically. The first failed migration is not a story of defeat. It is a story of persistence. Humans kept trying, kept learning, kept adapting, until eventually one attempt succeeded so completely that we forgot all the ones that came before. Today, there are 8 billion humans on Earth, descended from populations that may have numbered in the thousands during crisis periods. The successful migration did not just work, it worked beyond what any of those early pioneers could have imagined. If you are still awake right now, think about this. You exist because of successful migrations, but you are also shaped by the failed ones. The lessons encoded in your genes, the cultural memories of what happens when humans are cut off from each other, the instinct to build networks that no individual needs. The school people are part of your story even if their DNA is not in your cells. They showed that humans could leave Africa. They proved it was possible even when they could not make it work. Every journey begins with someone willing to take the first step. The drive that sent them walking north still operates in you. When you dream of distant places, when you imagine what lies beyond familiar boundaries, when you feel restless in comfortable surroundings, you are carrying forward something very old and very human. Neuroscientists have identified brain regions associated with novelty seeking and exploration. These traits have genetic components. They can be selected for or against over evolutionary time. The fact that you exist means your ancestors were curious enough to survive. 100,000 years ago, humans looked north and decided to walk. They did not know they were making history. They did not know they would fail. They just saw possibility and moved toward it. That is what humans do. Tonight, we explored one of the strangest chapters in human history, a migration that succeeded for thousands of years and then vanished. People who were us in every way that matters, living lives we can barely imagine, leaving traces we almost missed entirely. The research continues. Every year brings new discoveries, new technologies for analyzing ancient materials, new questions we did not know to ask. The school people have been dead for millennia, but their story keeps evolving as we learn more. If you enjoyed this journey through the first failed migration, subscribe and stick around. There are more mysteries waiting, more questions without answers, more stories of humans doing extraordinary things in impossible circumstances. The Skull people deserve to be remembered, not as failures, but as pioneers who showed what was possible. Their courage made later migrations thinkable. Their story reminds us that nothing is guaranteed, and their mystery keeps scientists digging decade after decade. Somewhere in the ground, more evidence waits to be found. Bones that have not been excavated, tools that have not been identified, sites that have not been discovered. The story of the first failed migration is not finished being written. Thank you for spending this time with me. Whether you made it to the end or drifted off somewhere in the middle, I hope you found something worth thinking about. The first migration that failed, the people who tried anyway, and the mystery that remains. Sleep well, dream of ancient journeys, and remember that you exist because someone somewhere kept trying after everyone else had stopped. That persistence lives in you. Good night.